Hello and welcome to the 2026 version of our benchmarking report. Pleased to see many of our repeat viewers and some of our clients and hopefully potential clients on the call today. So really pleased to see such a good number attending. This is now the 14th year that we have put together the benchmarking report, and I was trying to work out the first year that we carried out a webinar, and back way before Zoom and Teams was the norm. In terms of introductions, my name's Darren O'Connor. I'm one of the accounts and audit partners here at James Cooper Kreston, and I also head up the education sector, acting for a number of independent schools, academies and other educational bodies. And I'm also joined here today by Becky. Perhaps you could introduce yourself, Becky, please.
Hi, I'm Becky. I'm one of the audit directors, specialising in the education team. So similarly, I look after independent schools, academies and other educational bodies as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Becky. Just some housekeeping before we start. We will try and move through the slides reasonably quick. Please ask questions as we go. Please, can you ask those questions within the Q&A tab rather than the chat? That way we can log it, hold on to it, and if it's quite a specific question, we'll come back to you after the call or after the webinar. So I think we're ready to get started. So on to the next slide, please. So as an introduction, as I said, it's the Academies Benchmark Report 2026. And as a recap, it covers all the schools and trusts that sit within the Kreston network of firms, of which James Cooper Kreston is one. So this year, it's based on 250 academy trusts, which is approximately 2,500 schools. It's based on the statutory accounts that hopefully is a distant memory to you all, but was signed probably just before Christmas, and that was your 31st of August 2025 accounts. Within the benchmark data, we analyse it out between primary, secondary and maths, as you'd expect, and we'll go on to the terminology that's reflected there in a moment. I always say benchmarking is the starting point. It won't give you all the answers, but it could give you some food for thought of what's happening in your region or nationwide, and help you explore and perhaps interrogate your own data to see perhaps areas of improvement or areas where you're performing very well. On to the next page, please. So how to interpret the data? Well, it's a fairly lengthy report, just over 75 pages. In terms of the definitions are on 66, and that covers off lots of the acronyms that the academy sector is well known for, whether it's GAG or DFE and so on, which to most people on the call today will clearly have a handle on that. But there may be a few that are perhaps new to the sector and could do with brushing up on those definitions. We then list out the data in its raw form between 68 and 72, and that's split into 5 sections, one being primary school SATs, secondary school SATs, smaller MATs, which are defined as fewer than 3,000 pupils, medium, which is between 3,000 and 7,500, and then large MATs being over 7,500 in pupil numbers. Next slide, please. So I suppose I'm on to the spoiler alert, so I'll keep this very high level. I wouldn't want to give you all the answers straight away. So perhaps these are just some of the highlights that we aim to pick up on as we go through our slides. I think there's been improved performance this year. I think the data suggests that this is the best performance in terms of financial performance since 2022. But there is some caution there that although trusts continue to do very well, there are a number of trusts, and I think that is 26% of trusts still hold less than 5% of income as their reserve figure, which is relatively low in the scheme of things. I think that follows forward into reserves, improved reserve positions, and we are seeing that both in terms of financial performance and reserves, the good results, for want of a better word, tend to be in the larger MATs. So size does seem to matter. We are seeing an increase in MAT size as trusts take advantage of economies of scale and other resources to help improve their financial performance and reserves. A trend that's been picked up for the last couple of years and has continued is the increased centralisation, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. And then leading on to that is, as part of centralisation, we're seeing an increase in GAG pooling, or should I say income pooling, really. It's not just GAG, and reserve pooling across the trusts, which helps leverage on centralisation. So as I say, hopefully not too many spoilers there, but that's the highlights that we will seek to delve into over the next few slides. Next slide, please. So I think that's, I'll take a moment to catch my breath, and I'll hand over to Becky to talk through some of the benchmark report sections. Thank you, Becky.
Thanks, Darren. So yeah, looking firstly at the financial position then, this year's financial position shows improvement across the sector. Trust on a whole has outperformed budgets, with actual free reserves coming in well above the forecasts. And this is seen for the first time since 2021, where we've seen all trusts on average making an in-year surplus. However, the outperforming of budgets seems to be becoming quite the norm, with one of the biggest reasons why the sector consistently beats the budgets is the funding arrives quite late in the year, and usually after the budget forecast has been submitted, with this year's late funding being the school's core budget grants. When the allocations did come in this year in respect of this grant, it was and like the teacher's pension element of it was far in excess of what the trust anticipated. But really, for the trusts that are working on incredibly tight margins, the difference is huge. It also kind of gives the reason of why the budgets look very pessimistic, but then when the results come in, they're much stronger. So although the headlines are positive, SATs and MATs are operating still with quite small margins. Many posted only tens of thousands of pounds of surplus, which isn't really sustainable with these big budgets either. And then in addition, if you go one step further and we start looking at the depreciation and add that back in, as typically profits need to be made post-depreciation to start funding replacements of aging assets, money trusts would actually fall back into a deficit position, demonstrating that future estate management is still underfunded. This is more so important for the SATs and the smaller MATs who are only eligible for the SIF and the DFC funding, and somewhat reliant on the free reserves for some of their capital projects. However, one of the most encouraging figures this year is we've seen a reduction of the in-year deficits. Last year it was nearly 60% of trusts were in deficit, whereas this year it's fallen to around 37%, so a significant improvement there. However, the improvements are driven by the in-year grants, like the late funding that's come through, and it doesn't really address any long-term fixes to cost pressures or the uncertainty of the future funding. And like Darren also mentioned, reserves have grown across the trusts as a whole. 26% of the trusts still hold less than that 5% of income and reserves that the DFE has as kind of their overall target. And then looking at the budget forecasting then as well, budget predictions continue to be pretty poor across the sector. All trusts were forecasting a fall in reserves this year, yet all outperformed their expectations. So this actually raises the question as to whether the overly cautious budgeting is limiting certain decisions being made, such as recruitment choices or even investment. And the root cause of this is the income uncertainty. Trusts can forecast costs quite well, but not the income. Therefore, without the kind of the visibility on the future income, it does pose the question as to how useful these budget returns are, as the actual results tend to be significantly better. So I guess the overall message on the financial position then for this year is that the improvements to the trusts are real, but they're heavily dependent on these in-year like late funding, which doesn't really help any trust with kind of long-term planning. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Becky. I'll just give you a break there. We'll move to our first poll question. I think it's just interesting to hear what today's attendees feel around reserves in the future. So the question is, over the next 5 years, do you expect your trust reserves to increase, decrease, or remain the same? If you could please vote a single choice, please, that would be really, really helpful. I'll leave the poll open for another 5-10 seconds to see whether our pool of viewers today share similar viewpoints to potentially what we're seeing in our report. So if you wouldn't mind closing the poll there, and we'll bring. So we have an answer straight away. Good. So decrease in reserve 60%, remains similar level, which I think, yeah. So perhaps some cautiousness, uncertainty, and perhaps not the optimism that we would like to see within the sector, with 0% showing an increase, which is very interesting to see. Brilliant, thank you. So let's move on to the next slide.
That's me again. So thank you, Darren. So moving on to the income section then. So funding is up on paper, but stability still remains quite a concern. This year, overall income increased for both normal kind of revenue and capital streams as well. However, as noted already, this has been driven by additional unexpected grants, such as the core budget grant. Trusts still face short-term decision-making because budgets are set before the key funding announcements are confirmed. This ultimately could have an impact where trusts are forced to make certain cuts, which wouldn't have been done if the knowledge of this additional grant was known. So then all trusts saw an increase in total income per pupil. Medium maths up by 11%, large maths up by 5%, and SATs and small maths at around the 8% level. The rises, again, stems from the additional one-off grants, the core budget, teachers' pay, teachers' pension, and the national insurance grant, rather than actual changes to the core funding. GAG funding saw an increase of 7% per pupil, giving the real terms increase of around 3%. Media maths saw that the biggest rise at around 11.3%, whereas the secondary SATs only saw a 2.7% rise. And whilst it's unclear what caused the low increase, it does highlight disparity across trust types. SEN funding still remains one of the largest pressures. 64% of trusts named it as one of their top 3 financial concerns. And despite the additional government investment, SEN still seems insufficient to meet the rising needs in the sector. And capital funding. So capital funding notably increased in medium maths, rising at around 34%, largely due to the SCA allocation rules and the changes. So there's now the 25% minimum per school. And any trust in this SCA scheme do have the benefit of the estate management plans because they are getting known amounts on an annual basis. For all other trusts that are falling short of the requirement, the alternatives are namely the DFC and the SIF funding. DFC funding does not come close to meet estate management plans, and the SIF funding is uncertain due to bid requirements and if people are successful or not, making capital funding quite inconsistent across the sector. And then the investment income. So trusts have actually performed quite well investment income this year, which has been really driven through improved treasury management and investment diversification. There are a lot of new online investment platforms, and this has also supported the risk management by enabling trusts to kind of diversify their deposits across multiple institutions and maximising the protection under the Financial Service Compensation Scheme. Some of the trusts have gone one step further than these investment platforms, but trusts do need to consider their risk appetite before pursuing these options because they do tend to be a bit riskier. So what's the overall message, I guess, on the future funding? Despite there has been some increases this year, there still isn't any long-term government commitment to increase revenue per pupil, leaving the trusts still very reliant on short-term planning and short-term funding and coming in last minute. Next slide, please, Georgia. Perfect. So moving on to looking at some of the costs. So although the events of recent years, such as like the COVID, we've got inflation and the energy crisis has kind of stabilised now, we are facing a return of like the known unknowns, the pay awards, the agency costs and recruitment, which still is very dominant cost pressures for the sector, still making long-term planning quite challenging to all trusts. And our staff costs for the first year have exceeded 75% of total revenue across all trust types on average. This surpasses the long-term benchmark for financial sustainability and reflects the sector-wide increases in pay, pension, and national insurance. SATs and small mats and medium mats saw staff costs per pupil rate increase around 10 to 14%. Large mats saw a smaller increase of only around 6%, reflecting the economies of scale and the greater flexibility of moving the staff around large mats to maximise their coverage. And then the supply and retention. So we have seen this year a decrease in staff sickness of around 8% and reduced vacancies of around 22%. However, most trusts saw actually very little improvement in agency costs. This is largely due to inflation within the agency pricing, which continues to outpace the workforce improvements. And the pensions, so there's been quite a turn in the pensions in the last year. The LGPS revaluation brought positive news for many trusts, with the employers' contribution rates being reduced from April 26. This is a rare relief for quite a lot of trusts, especially those with larger support populations, as this should have an impact on reducing pension costs quite a bit. And then key management salaries and CEO salaries. So key management personnel, this tends to be quite a subjective area given of what each trust constitutes as key management personnel. But in SATs, the leadership costs per pupil increased broadly in line with overall staff costs growth of around 10%. Contrastly, in the large mats, leadership costs actually fell per pupil by almost 9%, probably again showing the economies of scale of these larger mats being in operation. And the CEO salaries, for the first time, this has exceeded in large mats the 200,000 level. And this is one of the costs that comes under quite a lot of scrutiny in the sector. And although it does attract a lot of attention, the leadership costs still remain quite proportionate. And it's only kind of the largest mats that are publishing these higher salaries. But overall, the message, I guess, with these salaries is the growth across the sector that has remained quite consistent. Next slide, please. And then just touching on some of the non-staff costs. So for the non-staff costs, the increase this year is only around 2.4%, notably below the CIP rate, which was at 3.8% at the time. This does welcome quite a change after several years of steep inflationary pressure. Trusts are constantly encouraged to find cost efficiencies in this area, but I think given the percentage of non-staff costs when compared against staff costs, there's only so much impact that this area can achieve. Repairs and maintenance still remains a major concern for trusts. Spending in this area is often dependent on the availability of capital income and whether the work is classified as capital or revenue, leading to quite large variations year on year in some of the results. And then the energy costs. So energy costs have fallen sharply for the second year, down roughly about 13.7%. Then the heat and light costs, if you look at by pupil level, in 2013, we're reporting about £150 per pupil. This has moved down to about £109 per pupil in 2025. But then this reduction is due to market price changes. The carbon usage itself has not fallen. This is based on the emission data covered in the MAT section of the benchmarking report. Next slide, please. And then finally, looking at the balance sheet position, this year's balance sheet is notably stronger across the board. Reserves has increased for all trust types, and significantly fewer trusts are in the in-year deficit. As already noted, last year 60% of trusts reported an in-year deficit. This year's reduced down to 37%, driven by late funding and tighter cost control or cuts being made due to the uncertainty of funding. And then in addition to this, some of the deficits that have been reported on further inquiry, a lot of it was down to planned activities such as estate management and staffing restructures. And every trust also performed better in their budget, in their actual results compared to budget forecast return. Secondary SATs on average were forecasting free reserves of around 406,000, actually achieved around the region of 932,000, and the large MATs on average were forecasting around 5.3 million, actually ended up at 8.9 million, so significant the swings there. And also, when we're looking at cumulative deficits as well, there's only around 3.7% of trusts that are in this cumulative deficit position, which is still very low proportion as a whole. In comparison, 17.8% of local authority maintained schools are now in deficit, which kind of leads to the question why the disparity, and perhaps this actually demonstrates the stronger financial oversight within the academy sector. And more so now when we're looking at the reserves positions, a lot more trusts are making use of designated funds to clearly show the intended purpose of reserves. This even when funds remain unrestricted. This does assist the users in the financial statements to help understand why reserves are being held for future use. Next slide, please. And then looking at cash and investments, both remain strong in the sector. Larger MATs tend to carry a higher amount per pupil of cash, mainly due to unspent SCA funding. A lot of these capital projects take quite a while to set up, finding contractors, etc. So a lot of that money is held on to for a bit longer than expected. However, we can see trusts being more active about finding better ways of holding their cash to maximise returns. Estate management, as usual, poses several issues, this year notably being the PFI rebuilding projects and RAC. A lot of the older PFI contracts are now reaching the end of their 25-year term. A lot of trusts are finding that some of the repair work had not been completed as required. One PFI operator went into liquidation as well, meaning that the trusts that this has affected now have the financial burden of completing this outstanding work that the contractor wasn't able to do due to going into the liquidation. In addition, the school rebuilding programme is far behind original timelines, which isn't helping a lot of trusts push forward with their estate management plans. And then also, RAC has cost a huge amount so far, around £111 million nationally. But after a new survey that's been conducted, many of the buildings that were affected are in poorer condition than first thought, which is ultimately going to lead to additional costs for future periods. The pensions, so the LGPS valuation has improved significantly. In the last couple of years, the combination of increasing asset values and the change in the actuarial assumptions have led to a lot of valuations moving into an asset position. However, as you would have seen, a lot of trusts aren't recognising the balance as an asset position due to the uncertainty of the recovery. So most trusts ended up in an ill position when looking at the LGPS. We're also seeing a decrease in contribution rates. The average is around 3%. Some of the median MATs have estimated this will save them around 750,000 in employers' contributions. Others will see a smaller reduction. It will just depends how well the scheme is formed and what rates are being applied. And the TPS obviously still remains a concern. Firstly, due to the significant increase in the rates at 28.68% now, but also due to a lot of the independent schools exiting the scheme. This is estimated at around 400 at the moment, reducing the contribution base within the scheme. That hasn't really been spoken about too much previously, as it doesn't tend to be a problem for most trusts. However, more recently, we are noticing that HMRC are conducting quite a few reviews, leading to queries being raised. And whilst they're in this period of review and queries, that's not being returned to schools until it's resolved. This can be quite problematic for some of the schools that do have a bit of a tighter cash flow problem. And then looking at types of queries that are being raised at the moment in respect of that, these tend to be around costs associated with trips and school uniforms that we're seeing. And then lastly, finance leases. As you're aware from the handbook changes from the 1st of September 24, trusts were allowed to enter into certain finance arrangements, predominantly due to the upcoming changes to the accounting standards. But to date, we haven't really seen a huge amount of impact with trusts entering into these new arrangements. But where we have seen it has been around solar panels and LED lighting. So where we haven't really seen many changes, it's not likely that we're expected to see the real changes until the change in the accounting standards was coming up quite soon. So I think that's everything on this slide. So moving on to the next, I think I'm passing back over to Darren now.
Thank you, Becky. So moving to the Multi-Academy Trusts section of the benchmarking report. I think most people are aware and are reasonably comfortable with MATs tend to increase year on year, albeit there's been a slowing down over the last few years, I think, as the critical mass, as most schools are now in some form of trust structure. Within this year, we've seen 748 schools enter MATs. Clear that most of those have joined existing MATs rather than setting up SATs, which is fairly common now. So 92% of all academy schools are part of MATs, which gives you an indication of the mix between SATs and MATs. But there is clearly a slowdown in the growth, up to 13.6 being the average number of schools in a MAT in 2025, up from 11.7 the year before. Next slide, please. So what else are we seeing on a MAT level? We're certainly seeing more centralisation, as I mentioned earlier, and that's been a growing theme over a number of years. We're seeing a trust now hold a number of functions centrally, whether that be HR, finance, estates, procurement, insurance, IT, for example, all tend to be held centrally now for consistency and economies of scale purposes. Really. And I think that then builds on to more and more academy trusts going down the GAG, or as I said earlier, income pooling and reserve pooling to allow that fully functioning centralised service. And I think then following that on a little bit further, it then does allow trusts to focus on safeguarding, making strategic decisions at a trust level, dealing with failing schools that potentially have falling pupil numbers. You can pool your resources to better manage those issues. I suppose leading on to it again, it's naturally then that as centralisation goes up, central recharges tend to go up. Gone are the days that most academy trusts had a 5% central recharge, which tended to be where we were 5 or so years ago. We are seeing now central recharge as a percentage going up, particularly in small and medium-sized trusts. Perhaps larger MATs can still function at somewhere between 5, 6 or 7%, for example. On to the next page, please. So let's take another break now just to ask our next poll question, a bit of audience participation, please. So do you expect your trust to take on new schools within the next 12 months? And that's a yes, no, or depends. Again, a single choice answer. I'll hold on now for a few moments. As I say, I think we've reached some form of critical mass. There'll still be marginal increases each year, but I think most schools are now within a trust. So I think the landscape is changing, let's say, over time. But it'd be interesting to see whether our viewers today follow a similar view as to what's reported in the report. So, Georgia, we could close the poll there, please. Okay, so 83% still think that they will grow in the next year. So that's really interesting to see, which, as I say, it shows a continuing trend. It'd be interesting to see whether that's at a slower pace or not than we've previously seen. Thank you. So on to the next slide then, please. So governance, perhaps a section that's not as focused on as perhaps some of the financials, but is no doubt very important to the long-term sustainability and risk management of a trust. We've reported here, and I know other commentators over the years have focused on the importance of board demographics. So that's having a broad range of skills, experience, background within that trust organisation. So from a skills point of view, making sure that you cover off HR, finance, IT, estates, procurement, education, all within that trust board is clearly very, very important. Elsewhere, looking for diversity as well. So that can be minorities, whether it's a broad spectrum of minorities that we're all aware of, to ensure that different experiences are being picked up and different knowledge gaps are being filled. I suppose the one we'll focus on here today is around age diversity. I think we're all aware that governing bodies tend to be full of perhaps slightly more grey-haired, elderly individuals or individuals perhaps getting towards the end of their career. I suppose because they've got more time on their hands. I look back to governing bodies that I've sat on. It can sometimes be quite daunting when the papers come through a week before and it's a big thick wedge of papers that need to be read, and you do sometimes feel a pressure to read them to make sure that you fulfill your duties appropriately. And so there is a bit of a timing issue there. So I think it's important for trusts over the next few years to look at how they can better attract younger generations. So maybe playing on what's in it for them. How will it help their career progression, advance their broad skill set for the future, help them find the job that they're looking for example, but also maybe being a bit more flexible and perhaps a little bit more understanding of some of the younger generations and what needs and challenges they face. Having very well run boards, very well chaired, with good flow of information, timely flow of information and the appropriate level should all help maybe avoid some of those daunting experiences that perhaps I experienced in the past. Moving to recruitment and unfilled vacancies, I think it follows on from that. Georgia, back to the slide before. Sorry, my fault. In terms of recruitment and unfilled vacancies, I think it follows on from my earlier points that it is becoming harder and harder to fill those positions. We are seeing some trusts looking at perhaps reducing their number of committees down to 2. Most at the moment have 3 or more. Whether that's workable, potentially, you could just end up with a few committees that are sort of too large to really fulfill all roles. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. And again, perhaps that goes back to committees being well run, well chaired, and having the right amount of information. And I suppose that leads us on to governance professionals. We have seen over time, as it becomes more important that these board meetings are run efficiently, that perhaps the traditional clerking role is not perhaps fit for the academy sector anymore. So we are seeing governance professionals, sometimes full-time, being employed by trusts to help them deal with the large amount of information that comes down from the SFA, from other regulatory bodies, risk profiling, safeguarding, and so on. That is all part of a governing body's responsibility. So it is certainly here to stay, governance professionals. Thank you, Georgia. On to the next slide, please. So I suppose that brings us towards the end now, challenges and future trends. In this section, I hope to tie in a lot of what we've talked about today. Confidence remains low, and I think that was picked up in a number of sections that Becky touched on. But okay, results have been pretty good and have certainly outperformed budgets. But we are, as Becky described very well, we're in the situation where budgets tend to be quite pessimistic and maybe does breed a culture of low confidence. On top of that, the lack of certainty over future income, definitely on the medium term, but even on shorter term, sometimes it's hard to know exactly what your income levels are going to be, and that's both from a mainstream income position and a capital fund position. So it's hard to be confident, I suppose. And Becky picked up on a great point there, how that may impact future decision making and strategic decision making. Do you end up in a position of status quo where you perhaps could be slightly more adventurous if you had more confidence and more foresight of what income could look like for the future? Another challenge on the horizon is there's information around trust level Ofsted inspections. Most inspections up till now, as most of the viewers on this call know, have been at school level, but we are seeing more at trust level, given that some of these large trusts now, a lot of the decision making around safeguarding, around educational curriculum, around future provisioning and so on is done at trust level. So it seems sensible that Ofsted would look at that level too. So ensuring that you have a consistent approach across your schools is clearly important, and will be something the Ofsted are focusing on. School white paper, I think, goes into the confidence bucket to some extent. That we are long awaiting a new white paper, and the government, I think we're all aware, have many issues that are perhaps at the moment taking more prominence than education. But it would be important to see what the government's, be useful to see what the government's view, longer term view is for education, and that would allow schools to trust to properly plan. Environmental targets, and Becky picked up on that earlier too, around we are seeing CO2 emissions at school level potentially not moving, certainly not decreasing significantly. So I wonder if that will put some fear into whether, as a government and as a society, we can meet some of those net zero positions and targets that we're aiming for by 2050. So lots of food for thought there, and challenges both financially and other as part of that. On to the next slide, please. So I suppose picking up on that, that's our view on where the challenges are. It'd be useful to hear from our viewers today to see if they echo some of these challenges. So what is the biggest challenge facing trusts? And this is multiple choice. To have potentially stop us skewing the data too much, perhaps keep your multiple choice to 3 if possible, and then we can get some good data that we can work with here. So the options are rising costs, government policy, recruitment, estate issues, falling pupils, or all of the above. So as I say, if we could keep our options to 3 if possible, I think that would make it easier to understand the final position. I'll just give it a couple more seconds. Thank you, Georgia. If you could close the poll there, please. So biggest challenges, rising costs, yes, and as Becky alluded to, that's both staff costs tend to be the main one, but not the only one. Government policy, and potentially that feeds into what I've just been discussing about. It's the uncertainty around government policy, potentially. Recruitment less so, which is interesting to see. Estate issues, as Becky alluded to, there are clearly estate issues at most, if not all, trusts. Falling pupil numbers, and this was something that was flagged in last year's benchmarking report, and it's continued. We are seeing a number of areas in the country where the demographics are potentially skewing and pupil numbers will reduce. given that most funding is on a per pupil basis, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time. And then all of the above, I think to some extent everyone could answer all of the above, given they're all real risks that need to be managed. Thank you for that. So moving to the next slide, please. So we're coming to the end. I suppose, what would my summary be? Clearly lots of food for thought, lots of challenges on the horizon, but some positivity, even if that's disguised by strangely uncertainty in the moment, and perhaps positivity slightly down the road or down the line. But as always, I'm sure the sector will remain flexible and nimble, and will be alert to these challenges, and will continue to succeed as it has done over the years. So hopefully by the next time we speak, the government will have potentially put some of the policies forward, and there'll be a little bit more certainty. But I think that's it from us today. Conscious of the time, I am aware of a few quick Q&As that have come through, and I think we'll take those offline and deal with them individually. As I say, I'm conscious that time is getting away from us slowly. So I think that just leaves me to thank Becky for joining me today, and thank Georgia in our marketing team for putting an excellent set of slides together and helping navigate us through them. And then thank you all viewers, both clients and others, for attending today. As always, if you have any questions, please do reach out to your usual contact at James Cooper Kreston or Becky or myself for further guidance. And there were a few useful links there on that final slide that may also give you some food for thought. So that finishes us 15 minutes away from 12 o'clock and lunchtime, which sounds like a perfect time to finish. So thank you, everyone. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day.